In London this morning, Prince Harry is testifying in the latest lawsuit against a British tabloid, the court case against the owners of the Daily.
In the final week of February, a quiet financial document left Buckingham Palace. By the time it reached California, it carried a number so staggering it could not be ignored. And suddenly, Prince Harry was facing a bill that even royal blood could not easily escape. The letter that crossed the Atlantic. In the final days of February, Buckingham Palace was moving through one of those quiet administrative mornings that rarely attracted public attention. The grand staterooms remained closed to visitors, their chandeliers dimmed in the pale winter light. Outside, the courtyard guards carried out their routine duties with the same steady precision that had defined the palace for generations. From the outside, nothing suggested that anything unusual was happening behind the historic stone walls. But inside a smaller office suite deep within the palace's administrative wing, a very different conversation was unfolding. A group of senior financial advisors had gathered around a polished table covered with documents, spreadsheets, and briefing folders that had been accumulating for months. These were not ceremonial papers or public announcements. They were the quiet machinery of royal accounting, the detailed records that tracked the complex financial obligations surrounding the monarchy. And one particular file had grown thicker than anyone had expected. The file carried a name that few inside the palace needed, explained. Prince Harry. For several years now, the financial consequences of Harry and Meghan's departure from royal duties had lingered in a gray area between personal arrangements and institutional responsibilities. When the Duke and Duchess of Sussex stepped back from their roles in early 2020, the separation had been presented publicly as a clean break. But behind the scenes, the reality was far more complicated. Royal households were not simple organizations. They operated through layers of property agreements, security arrangements, staffing costs, and logistical systems that had developed over decades. Untangling those systems after Harry's departure had required patience, negotiation, and an enormous amount of administrative work. At first, palace officials had hoped that many of the financial matters would resolve themselves gradually. Some costs had already been addressed. Others had been absorbed quietly by various royal departments. A few had simply remained in limbo while advisors attempted to determine where the responsibility ultimately belonged. But as the years passed, one conclusion had slowly emerged among the palace's financial staff. The numbers were no longer small. One advisor carefully opened a thick folder and slid a summary page across the table. The figures had been reviewed repeatedly over the previous months by legal teams, treasury specialists, and royal accountants who understood the importance of precision. At the bottom of the page, the final total was written clearly: £59 million. The amount represented a complicated collection of expenses connected to Harry and Meghan's exit from royal life. Some of the costs dated back several years. Others were tied to ongoing legal and logistical issues that had continued long after the couple had settled in California. Among the largest figures were the renovation expenses linked to Frogmore Cottage, the Windsor property that had been extensively updated before the couple's departure. There were also substantial security costs that had arisen during the complicated transition period when Harry and Meghan moved between countries. Legal fees connected to media disputes had added another layer of expense. Administrative costs tied to property restructuring and royal staff adjustments had quietly accumulated as well. Individually, none of these costs seemed extraordinary within the complex financial world of the monarchy. But together, they formed a number that could no longer be ignored. The advisors understood that presenting such a figure required careful consideration. Royal finances were not merely accounting exercises. They carried political and symbolic weight, particularly when family relationships were involved. For weeks, the matter had been discussed cautiously among senior palace officials. Eventually, the issue reached the desk of King Charles himself. The king listened carefully as the financial advisors explained the situation. They outlined how the expenses had developed over time and why leaving them unresolved might create complications for the institution in the future. Charles asked several detailed questions. He wanted to know which costs had already been addressed and which remained disputed. He asked how the figures had been calculated and whether any portion of the amount might reasonably be considered shared responsibility. The advisors answered each question methodically, Their conclusion was consistent. If the monarchy intended to maintain clear financial boundaries, the outstanding balance could not remain indefinite. For Charles, the decision carried both institutional and personal weight. Harry was not simply a former royal official. He was the king's son. Their relationship had already endured years of public strain, emotional distance, and painful misunderstandings. But Charles also understood something fundamental about the crown he now carried. The monarchy could not operate on informal arrangements forever. Eventually, every unresolved matter demanded clarity. And so, after several days of quiet deliberation, the king approved a step that many inside the palace had long suspected might become necessary. A formal financial invoice would be prepared. The document itself was written in careful language. It outlined the categories of expenses and provided a clear summary of the total figure calculated by the palace's financial offices. At the bottom of the final page, the number appeared again, £59 million. When the paperwork was complete, it was sealed and prepared for delivery through official channels. Within hours, the document left Buckingham Palace and began its journey across the Atlantic. Somewhere in California, Prince Harry was about to receive a letter that would reopen questions far larger than money. Because inside royal families, financial accounts rarely tell the whole story. Sometimes they reveal something much deeper: the cost of a royal exit. When Prince Harry and Meghan stepped back from royal duties in the early weeks of 2020, the public announcement had been presented with the calm language of modern transition. The statement spoke about independence, about building a new life beyond the structures of royal service, and about creating space for personal freedom outside the constraints of palace expectations. To many observers, it sounded like a clean separation. Inside the palace, however, the situation was never quite that simple. The monarchy was not merely a family. It was an institution supported by layers of administrative systems that stretched across government departments, private estates, historical properties, and security frameworks that had evolved over generations. When one senior royal withdrew from that system, the ripple effects moved far beyond public appearances and ceremonial roles. Prince Harry's departure triggered exactly those kinds of ripples. At first, the palace approached the situation with caution. Advisors hoped that many of the practical details could be resolved quietly, while Harry and Meghan settled into their new life abroad. Negotiations took place behind closed doors, focusing on how to disentangle years of logistical and financial arrangements without turning the process into a public spectacle. But every solution created new complications. One of the earliest issues involved Frogmore Cottage. The Windsor property had been selected as Harry and Meghan's primary residence shortly after their marriage. Before they moved in, the building underwent a major renovation funded through royal financial channels. The project was extensive. Structural improvements were made, interiors were redesigned, and security systems were upgraded to meet the standards required for senior members of the royal family. At the time, the renovations were treated as a long-term investment. Few people imagined that the couple would leave royal duties so soon afterward. When Harry and Meghan relocated to North America, questions about the property quickly surfaced. Should the renovations remain a public expense if the house was no longer serving its intended purpose? Could the costs be recovered, or would they simply remain part of the monarchy's operating budget? For a time, the matter appeared to settle itself when Harry agreed to reimburse a portion of the renovation expenses. Yet within palace accounting offices, the full financial picture proved far more complex. Frogmore Cottage had not been renovated in isolation. Infrastructure surrounding the property had also been upgraded to accommodate its new residents. Staffing arrangements had been reorganized. Security logistics had been modified to protect the property and its occupants. Those adjustments carried costs that extended far beyond the renovation itself. Then, there was the matter of security. Protecting members of the royal family was never a simple responsibility. Security operations involved coordination between royal protection units, local police forces, and government agencies responsible for monitoring potential threats. When Harry and Meghan stepped away from official royal duties, the question of who would fund their security became one of the most sensitive issues in the entire transition. Initially, there were discussions about temporary arrangements. The palace, government officials, and security planners explored several possible solutions as the couple relocated first to Canada and later to California. Each stage of that relocation required adjustments to protection protocols. Those adjustments were expensive. Security teams had to conduct threat assessments, plan transportation logistics, and establish new coordination channels with international authorities. Even after Harry and Meghan settled in the United States, the complexity of protecting a prince who was no longer an active working royal continued generating significant administrative costs. Legal matters added another layer. Over the years following their departure, Harry became involved in several legal disputes related to media privacy and personal security arrangements. While many of those cases were pursued independently, they still intersected with palace infrastructure in subtle ways. Advisors, legal consultants, and royal administrative staff frequently found themselves drawn into background discussions about institutional responsibilities. Each consultation carried its own expenses. At first, the palace absorbed many of these costs quietly. Royal households had always maintained contingency funds for unusual situations. Historically, those funds had covered everything from property repairs to emergency travel arrangements. But as months turned into years, the financial impact of Harry and Meghan's departure began stretching beyond what those reserves were designed to handle. Accounting teams started tracking the numbers more closely. They reviewed property expenses tied to unused royal residences. They calculated the administrative costs associated with restructuring staff roles after the Sussex household dissolved. They documented security-related expenditures that had arisen during the transition period. Individually, each line item appeared manageable. Collectively, they painted a different picture. Gradually, the figures accumulated into a sum that palace officials could no longer treat as incidental. By late 2024, financial advisors were presenting internal summaries showing how the total had continued climbing year after year. Some costs had stabilized, but others persisted through legal reviews, property adjustments, and ongoing administrative obligations. That was when the conversation inside Buckingham Palace began to change. At first, advisors spoke about the issue cautiously. Royal finances were a delicate subject, especially when they involved members of the family. No one wanted to create the impression that the monarchy was turning internal disagreements into public financial disputes. But institutions rely on clarity, and the longer these expenses remained unresolved, the more complicated the accounting became. Some advisors argued that the costs should simply remain part of the monarchy's broader operational budget. Others believed that doing so would blur the boundary between institutional responsibility and personal decision. That boundary mattered more than many people realized. The monarchy's credibility depended partly on the perception that its financial systems were transparent and disciplined. Allowing large unresolved expenses to linger indefinitely risked raising uncomfortable questions about accountability. By the beginning of 2025, the matter had reached a point where senior palace officials could no longer avoid addressing it directly. What had started as a series of scattered administrative costs had slowly transformed into a financial narrative of its own, one that carried a total few inside the palace had ever been expected to be attached to a single royal departure: £59 million. And once that number appeared clearly on paper, the palace faced a difficult realization. Ignoring it was no longer an option. Meghan's quiet financial moves. While Buckingham Palace was still trying to untangle the financial consequences of Harry and Meghan's departure, another development had quietly begun unfolding thousands of miles away. It was not announced publicly. There were no interviews explaining it, no statements posted through representatives. In fact, most of the public remained completely unaware that anything unusual was happening at all. But within certain financial circles, subtle changes were beginning to appear. Over the course of several months, in late 2024 and early 2025, a number of adjustments connected to Meghan's personal business interests began surfacing in corporate filings, property records, and investment restructurings. None of these changes looked dramatic on their own. Each appeared to be part of ordinary financial management. Yet when viewed together, they formed a pattern, and patterns rarely escape the attention of people trained to study them. Several business ventures previously associated with joint Sussex branding quietly shifted into new ownership structures. Some partnerships were reorganized under different management entities. A few smaller investment positions connected to media and lifestyle projects were reportedly sold off or absorbed into separate holding companies. For most entrepreneurs, these kinds of adjustments would have passed unnoticed. But Meghan was not simply another entrepreneur. She was the Duchess of Sussex, a figure whose financial activities had long attracted interest from both media observers and palace analysts. Whenever a change occurred in her business structure, someone somewhere usually noticed. Inside Buckingham Palace, the Royal Financial Office monitored those developments with growing curiosity. At first, the adjustments did not seem directly connected to the palace's ongoing accounting review regarding Harry's departure costs. The two situations existed in entirely different financial worlds. Meghan's ventures were private commercial projects, while the palace's calculations involved institutional expenses tied to royal operations. Yet some advisors began asking quiet questions. Why were these restructurings happening now? Why were several assets being liquidated or repositioned at roughly the same time? One senior financial advisor reportedly described the activity as strategic consolidation. The phrase carried a neutral tone, but it hinted at a possibility that some inside the palace found difficult to ignore. Meghan might be preparing for a more independent financial structure. The idea was not entirely surprising. Since relocating to California, Meghan had steadily expanded her identity beyond royal associations. Media production deals, brand partnerships, and speaking engagements had gradually built a professional portfolio that operated outside traditional royal frameworks. Financial independence had always been part of the Sussex strategy, but the timing of these latest adjustments raised new questions. Because during the same period that Meghan's assets were being reorganized, Buckingham Palace was finalizing its own financial calculations related to Harry's outstanding obligations. The two timelines began to overlap in ways that palace advisors could not easily dismiss as coincidence. Behind closed doors, some staff members wondered whether Meghan's financial restructuring might be connected to internal planning within the Sussex household itself. Marriage, particularly one lived under relentless public scrutiny, often carried pressures that outsiders could not fully see, and financial planning was sometimes the first place where those pressures revealed themselves. There was no clear evidence that Harry and Meghan were experiencing serious personal tension. Publicly, the couple continued presenting a united front through occasional appearances and carefully managed statements. But financial advisors understood something that public observers often overlooked. Money decisions frequently expose deeper strategic thinking. If Meghan was reorganizing her assets, it suggested that she was preparing for future scenarios that required flexibility and control. Entrepreneurs often took such steps when anticipating major shifts in business direction, legal exposure, or long-term financial responsibility. Inside Buckingham Palace, those possibilities added another layer of complexity to an already sensitive situation. Because if Meghan's finances were becoming more structurally independent, it raised a quiet but unsettling question. Where did that leave Harry? The Duke of Sussex had pursued several commercial projects of his own, but many of the couple's ventures were intertwined through shared branding and joint agreements. Untangling those connections would not be simple if their financial paths began diverging. Some palace advisors began considering a scenario that had once seemed unlikely. If the palace eventually issued a formal demand regarding the outstanding £59 million, Harry might find himself responsible for negotiating that obligation largely on his own. And if Meghan's assets had already been positioned beyond the reach of those discussions, the financial burden could fall squarely on the prince who had once walked away from the institution that now held the invoice. It was still only speculation. No official documents suggested that Meghan had abandoned any shared responsibilities. No statements indicated that the Sussex household was preparing for a financial separation. But inside the quiet offices of Buckingham Palace, the timing of those financial moves did not go unnoticed. And as the palace prepared to send its formal letter across the Atlantic, one possibility lingered in the minds of several advisors. By the time Prince Harry opened that envelope, the financial ground beneath him might already have shifted. Harry receives the invoice. The document arrived in California on an otherwise ordinary afternoon. Prince Harry had grown used to receiving official correspondence from Britain. Some letters carried legal updates connected to his ongoing disputes with British media organizations. Others contained administrative details related to charities or remaining institutional matters that occasionally required his attention. But the envelope delivered that day felt different the moment it reached his desk. The return address alone carried weight: Buckingham Palace. For a moment, Harry simply stared at it. The past several years had already been defined by distance, geographic, emotional, and institutional. Communications between the Sussex household and the palace had become more formal, more measured, often filtered through advisors and legal representatives rather than direct conversation. A letter from the palace was no longer routine. Harry opened the envelope slowly. Inside was a neatly prepared document written in the restrained language of official correspondence. The tone was professional, almost clinical, the kind of wording used when institutions addressed financial matters that required clarity rather than emotion. At first glance, the pages appeared straightforward. There was an explanation of administrative reviews conducted over the previous months, a summary of expenses tied to logistical adjustments following Harry and Meghan's departure from royal duties, a reference to property modifications, security arrangements, legal consultations, and infrastructure costs that had accumulated during the transition. Harry read each line carefully. The language remained neutral throughout. No accusations were made. No personal commentary appeared anywhere in the document. But the purpose of the letter was unmistakable. Near the end of the final page, a single figure was printed clearly: £59 million. Harry paused when he saw the number. Even within royal circles, where estates and investments often involved large sums, the figure carried a kind of weight that could not easily be ignored. It was not the kind of amount that could be addressed through simple repayment plans or quiet financial adjustments. It represented years of institutional expenses condensed into one demand. For several seconds, Harry said nothing. The room around him was silent, except for the faint hum of afternoon traffic outside the property. California sunlight filtered through the windows, casting soft shadows across the desk where the letter now lay open. But Harry's attention remained fixed on the final paragraph. The palace had not framed the invoice as punishment. Instead, it described the figure as the result of a comprehensive financial review intended to clarify outstanding obligations connected to the restructuring of royal operations following the Sussex departure. In other words, the palace believed the debt belonged to him. Harry leaned back in his chair. The past few years had already been defined by difficult conversations with his family, public criticism from certain segments of the British press, and the complex challenge of building a new life far from the structures that had shaped his upbringing. Yet this letter introduced a new dimension to the conflict: money. Financial disputes had a way of transforming personal disagreements into something colder, more formal. When numbers replaced emotions, the arguments often became harder to resolve. Harry read the document again, this time focusing on the explanations attached to each category of expense: Frogmore Cottage renovations, security transition costs, administrative restructuring inside the royal household, legal consultations connected to institutional obligations. Each section presented its own rationale, supported by internal accounting references and legal language designed to demonstrate that the calculations had been reviewed carefully. Still, the total remained the same: £59 million. For Harry, the implications unfolded slowly. Accepting the invoice would mean acknowledging a financial responsibility tied directly to his decision to leave royal duties. Challenging the amount could trigger a legal and institutional dispute with the very family he had once served beside. Neither option promised an easy outcome, and somewhere within the quiet weight of that realization was another thought that Harry could not entirely ignore. By the time the letter reached him, the palace had already made its position clear. The era of informal arrangements between father and son might be over. What remained now was an official demand written on palace letterhead, one that forced Prince Harry to confront a question he had never expected to face. How much did independence truly cost? Shockwaves through the royal family. Inside Buckingham Palace, news of the invoice did not explode outward in dramatic fashion. Royal institutions rarely worked that way. Information traveled through carefully managed channels, shared only with those whose responsibilities required them to know. Yet even within those controlled boundaries, the significance of the decision quickly became clear. The king had taken a step that few people inside the palace had believed would ever occur. A formal financial demand had been issued to his own son. For senior palace staff, the development carried a heavy emotional weight. Many of them had served the royal family for decades. Watching the princes grow from young boys, walking behind their mother's coffin, into the men whose lives now unfolded across different continents and very different circumstances. The idea that the relationship between father and son had reached a point where money had entered the equation felt deeply uncomfortable, but the monarchy had always demanded a certain discipline from those who served it. Within hours of the letter being dispatched, several senior advisors gathered for private discussions about how the situation might evolve. Their concerns were not limited to the financial implications. They were also thinking about the broader institutional consequences. If the invoice became public, the story would inevitably trigger intense media interest. Questions would arise about how the figure had been calculated. Commentators would debate whether the palace was enforcing accountability or escalating a family conflict that had already caused years of strain. Some advisors worried that the situation could spiral into yet another public dispute between the Sussex household and the rest of the royal family. Others believed the opposite. In their view, the king's decision represented a necessary boundary. The monarchy's finances were not personal allowances that could be adjusted indefinitely through informal agreements. They were part of a larger institutional structure that required clarity and accountability. Among the most supportive voices, according to palace insiders, was Prince William. The Prince of Wales had long been aware of the administrative complications created by Harry's departure from royal duties. While the brothers' relationship had deteriorated significantly in recent years, William still understood the practical challenges facing the palace. In private conversations, he reportedly supported the king's decision as an act of institutional responsibility rather than personal retaliation. The monarchy, William believed, could not maintain credibility if its financial rules applied differently to members of the family. Princess Anne expressed a similar perspective. Anne had spent most of her life demonstrating an unwavering commitment to royal duty, often carrying out hundreds of engagements each year without complaint or public drama. Her approach to royal service had always been grounded in discipline and accountability. To her, the issue was straightforward. If costs had accumulated through a structural transition, then those costs needed to be addressed clearly. Camilla, meanwhile, remained largely silent. Those close to the Queen Consort understood that the situation was delicate. Her relationship with Harry had never been simple, and recent years had only deepened the distance between them. For Camilla, the best course of action was to avoid public commentary entirely. Instead, she continued carrying out her public responsibilities with the calm composure that had gradually become one of her defining traits. Yet, even without direct involvement, the unfolding dispute cast a long shadow over the royal household. Staff members could feel the tension in subtle ways. Conversations paused when certain topics arose. Advisors spoke carefully when discussing family matters during official briefings. Everyone understood that the financial question was only one part of a much deeper fracture. Because behind the invoice, behind the spreadsheets and accounting summaries, lay a family that had been struggling for years to find its way back to one another. The document traveling across the Atlantic represented more than a bill. It represented a boundary. And whether Prince Harry chose to accept it, challenge it, or attempt to negotiate a different outcome would determine not only the future of the financial dispute, but the future of his already fragile relationship with the royal family itself. For now, Buckingham Palace could only wait. The letter had been sent. The next move would belong to Harry, a debt that may change everything. In royal history, family disagreements rarely remain private forever. They may begin quietly, unfolding behind the thick walls of palaces and private estates, but eventually the weight of public attention pulls them into the open. When that happens, the arguments are no longer simply about emotions or misunderstandings. They become symbols. And the financial dispute now hanging between Buckingham Palace and Prince Harry carried exactly that kind of symbolic weight. For Harry, the letter from the palace was more than an invoice. It represented a moment where the consequences of his decision to step away from royal life had been translated into something measurable, something that could not easily be dismissed or ignored. £59 million. The number lingered with a kind of stubborn clarity. Accepting the invoice would mean acknowledging that the financial structures of the monarchy still held authority over choices he believed were personal and necessary. Challenging the amount, however, could ignite a legal and public battle with the very institution that had shaped his entire identity. Neither path offered a simple resolution. The deeper question was not just whether Harry would pay, it was what the act of payment would represent. Royal families have always struggled with the tension between individual independence and institutional loyalty. When a prince steps outside the structures of the crown, the transition is never purely personal. It carries financial implications, political implications, and emotional consequences that ripple through the family itself. Harry's departure had already reshaped those dynamics in ways that few people had anticipated. But this moment, the arrival of a formal financial demand from Buckingham Palace, pushed the situation into unfamiliar territory. Observers across Britain and the began speculating about what might happen next. Some believed the invoice would eventually be negotiated quietly, behind closed doors, resolved through the kind of discreet compromise that royal households had relied on for centuries. Others wondered whether Harry might challenge the demand publicly, transforming the dispute into another chapter of the long and complicated narrative surrounding his separation from the monarchy. Inside the palace, advisors watched the situation carefully. King Charles had made his position clear. The financial review had been conducted, the figure had been calculated, and the letter had been sent. From the palace's perspective, the matter was now one of response, rather than reconsideration. Yet Charles also understood something that no accounting report could fully capture. The issue was not only about money, it was about a father and a son whose relationship had been tested by distance, by public controversy, and by the difficult choices that often accompany royal duty. Financial disputes have a way of exposing deeper emotional fractures. Numbers can turn quiet tensions into visible divisions, forcing families to confront questions that might otherwise remain unspoken. For the monarchy, the situation carried an additional layer of meaning. The institution had survived centuries of political upheaval, abdications, scandals, and reinventions. Its strength had always depended on its ability to adapt while preserving a sense of continuity. Now that continuity faced another challenge. Because somewhere between Buckingham Palace and California, between the crown and the prince who had walked away from it, a letter had drawn a line that could not easily be erased. And how Prince Harry chose to respond to that line might shape the next chapter of the royal family's story in ways no one inside the palace could fully predict.